We thought today would be a good opportunity for us to bring about some initial discussion of these issues that are really incredibly relevant to many aspects of things that are affecting planning, things that actually are representing the values of Britain today, I would say, when we look at things to do with housing or attitudes to how we basically should use the land of our country. So I'm going to have the three speakers that we have today say a few words, and then we're going to get into a discussion, a debate maybe, around these issues. And so I'm very pleased to say that we have speakers representing a kind of range of interests here today. My first speaker will be Paul Meader, who is the campaign and planning manager from the Campaign to Protect Rural England, an organisation that was incredibly important in the movement that led to the creation of the Green Belt. So Paul is obviously going to come from a fairly clear perspective that you might imagine, fairly conservation perspective around Green Belt, and will tell us some things about how CPRE see the situation today as well. Next to Paul is Andy Meader from the Pegasus Planning Group, the director there. And of course, Pegasus, as a very major planning and landscape, a multidisciplinary consultancy around Britain, get a lot of insight into how things are actually happening in the Greenbelt. They've worked on major plans around Greenbelt, around various towns and cities, and they've also worked on very specific projects. So Andy will share us some of the insights into some of the pressures that are happening around Greenbelt today. And development, for all that the Greenbelt is a protective area, development is going on all the time. Many applications going through, so we'll get some insight into what gets approved, what doesn't get approved, and perhaps what we think of that. And my final speaker, as I mentioned, Paul Lincoln, sitting here from Landscape Institute. Paul, who's Deputy Chief Executive at Landscape Institute, worked with me on this exhibition, and the Landscape Institute has done some really interesting research among its members as to what they think about Greenbelt, their various perspectives on what should happen with Greenbelt, and also has come up with some interesting ideas on sort of forward thinking about how we should talk about Greenbelt, how we should approach decisions around Greenbelt. So he'll share some of that research and some of those ideas. But first of all, I'd like to begin with Paul Meader to outline where the CPRE see the state of Greenbelt today, and why we should cherish it, why we should care about some of the issues bringing pressure to bear on it. Paul.
Thank you very much, Lewis, and thank you very much to Landscape Institute and Ecobuild for holding this event. The Campaign to Protect Rural England was established in 1926, so we're celebrating our 90th anniversary this year. And last year was also a very auspicious anniversary because it was the 60th anniversary of the creation of a national Greenbelt policy. And since the ministerial circular in 1955, Greenbelt policy has remained largely unchanged in its fundamental principles, which are to prevent the uncontrolled sprawl of large urban areas, stop places joining up together, and to protect the countryside from encroachment, and to encourage the reuse of urban land through regeneration and rebuilding on previously developed land. And those purposes are as important today as in the 1950s. In fact, we would argue even more so, because over time we've seen that in the late 20th century and into the 21st, urban sprawl has become one of the greatest planning problems facing the world today. That across continental Europe and North America, we've seen uncontrolled sprawl, and it's been a particular problem in around the largest urban areas. And this has been borne out by studies that have been carried out by UN Habitat, the United Nations Planning Agency, and by the European Commission. And it's those large urban areas where in England we have green belts which have worked very effectively to stop this uncontrolled urban sprawl. And with a growing population, with growing pressures of climate change, we're going to need to be able to manage the growth of our towns and cities even more now than we did in the past. So Greenbelt is still vitally important in terms of its fundamental purposes. But also, Greenbelts protect a large area of largely undeveloped land, and the range of benefits some call ecosystem services or natural capital that this undeveloped land provides, is also hugely valuable. And again, it too will become more valuable in future as the population of London and other large cities continues to grow. And what's given us particular cause for concern is that there's been a range of reports that have been recently produced by think tanks, economists and others that time and again have consistently underestimated the value of the Greenbelt to society. If I give an example, the Adam Smith Institute produced a report that said that Greenbelts are actually much less valuable than other types of urban open space, and they gave a value of about just under £900 per hectare per year. But they were basing that valuation on a study of a few fields around Chester in 1992. But if you look at where Greenbelts are, they surround London, Birmingham, Manchester, Bristol and other places. The sheer value of these areas of largely protected countryside is likely to be much higher because it includes large areas of woodland, large areas of wetland, areas where people can walk. The areas of, in particular in the Greenbelt, there's a much denser network of public footpaths than there is in the countryside as a whole. So there's actually very significant opportunities for the public to experience the countryside in these areas. And again, with our large towns and cities growing in population, these will become more valuable in future. Most of the Greenbelt is in agricultural use, and some of it may not be farmed to a very environmentally high standard, but in more recent years, this problem has begun to be dealt with through the government funding more environmentally sensitive land management, environmental stewardship schemes. We need to be thinking about how we can encourage this kind of better land management in future, and that's why at present we've commissioned the consultancy ADAS to do some further work for us on natural capital and recreational opportunities in the Greenbelt. And we're looking at a number of studies across London, across the North East and also in the West Midlands to see what good practice we can take. We think that the vast majority of Greenbelts that, as they're currently designated, will remain there in the future, and it's right that they should remain so. That there may be some areas of the Greenbelt that can be redeveloped, that some small areas of the Greenbelt are brownfield sites, for example, and in many cases these could be beneficially redeveloped. But the vast majority of the Greenbelt should remain undeveloped for the foreseeable future, and we should be looking to manage it better for people and for wildlife, and also to adapt to the growing pressures of climate change and population growth.
So Paul, the brownfield sites, they can't, unless one changes the designation, they basically only can be reused for like farm buildings, or you have to really go through quite a lot of hoops to get these brownfield sites into use as, say, housing. How does the CPRE feel about allowing those brownfield sites to be reused? In fact, the government's planning consultation that's recently going on suggested that perhaps those brownfield sites should be taken for starter homes. What's your position on that?
Overall, CPRE welcomes a greater focus on the reuse of brownfield sites, because overall there's still plenty of brownfield land across this country that's available for development that we should be reusing before we go on to even consider building on the greenfield sites in the Greenbelt or elsewhere. And a small proportion of the Greenbelt is classed as brownfield. About 7% of the Greenbelt is classed as brownfield or previously developed land. But many of these brownfield sites in the Greenbelt are often former hospitals or institutions that were allowed to develop as an exception to Greenbelt policy, and often these former institutions are in large areas of landscaped grounds, often historic parks and gardens. And we've had a long-established approach in Greenbelt policy that when you're redeveloping these sites, you shouldn't go beyond the footprint of the existing buildings. And there are some places like the old Cane Hill Hospital at Coulsdon in South London, for example, which has been redeveloped for hundreds of new homes, and that's worked really well because there are large areas of buildings. It was also very near Coulsdon South train station, so it was a reasonably sustainable development in that sense. But there's work being done by the Royal Town Planning Institute which has shown that a lot of these brownfield sites are actually in very isolated locations. so wouldn't necessarily be suitable for intensive redevelopment. And also Bug Life, the conservation charity who we work with through Wildlife and Countryside Link, of which I'm a trustee, they've also found that a small minority of brownfield sites also have particularly high wildlife value as open mosaic habitat. So we should be looking to protect this habitat where possible. So we do need a careful approach to these sites, because in many cases, although we could redevelop them, but also in many cases we should actually be looking to perhaps return them to nature or manage them more sensitively for wildlife.
I want to switch to Andy now. Andy, you've got real sort of on-the-ground project after project experience of working in the Greenbelt. Could you tell us a bit about the pressures, the opportunities, the issues as you see it from Pegasus' point of view?
Yeah, thanks Lewis. Just as a brief bit of background, I've been a planning officer at Hertsmere Council, which is to the north of London in the Greenbelt, and then more recently working in the Thames Valley across projects in the private sector, projects across the southeast. So been involved with a lot of Greenbelt projects. I think perhaps if I could give a couple of examples at both ends of the spectrum as far as scale of development. Firstly, just a single household that was proposed on an old farm site in the Greenbelt, and as a result, because it wasn't defined as previously developed land because of its agricultural use, the council correctly deemed that very special circumstances had to be shown, as you would do for typically a new house in the Greenbelt. They determined they hadn't been shown, and as a result refused the scheme on principle. However, it was an interesting one because the house was designed to zero carbon targets, admittedly not as relevant now given the changes more recently, but at the time was considered to be very, very important as far as a really innovative design that was going to take that level of technology forward. The council acknowledged that in terms of appearance, in terms of visual impact, they thought it was entirely acceptable, and along with a good landscaping scheme would actually enhance the setting of the area. But because of this, in principle, it's in the Greenbelt, we don't allow a new house, they refused it. We took it to appeal, and we were successful in winning the appeal on that very special circumstances case. Interestingly, because the house was as innovative as it is, it actually hasn't been built because the client, who was only able to fund it through the quite expensive appeal process, has now determined that actually it's not as attractive because it really is pushing the technologies, it's very expensive, can't actually develop it. So we've got a scenario where the council themselves have acknowledged in visual terms a new house there is acceptable. It's just the principle of not allowing one there, and this was in a comparatively sustainable location. And as a result, the site remains partly derelict, pretty unattractive. Question marks as to whether that is a sensible approach as far as encouraging new houses, just even at a small scale level. As touched upon by Lewis, there is a consultation document looking at whether more allowance should be given for new housing on previously developed sites, albeit that is towards the starter housing in particular. I'd potentially ask the question, if it's appropriate for starter housing, then why shouldn't it be appropriate for any housing, really? If the principle of putting a new house on a previously developed site in the Greenbelt is acceptable, then why should it be restricted to starter homes? At the other end of the scale, Pegasus were instructed, back in 2009, to assist Guildford Borough Council on their Greenbelt study. For a long time, during the previous South East Plan, had identified that Guildford should accommodate several thousand houses, and as a result they would have to go into the Greenbelt to accommodate these. Whilst the South East Plan fell away, the council, rather than looking to focus on a particular area that had been identified in that South East Plan, wanted to do a wider study of their Greenbelt to assess whether there are going to be other opportunities to introduce what could be significant levels of development into the Greenbelt. So we, as I say, were commissioned back in 2009 to start working on that. And the study we produced was eventually published by the council in 2013. Now, I should emphasise that wasn't because we were tardy with it. We did it as swiftly as was reasonable. There were the changes in national guidance in the meantime, which meant a few tweaks were made. The primary reason for the delay was effectively because of the councillors concerns about going public with a document that suggested they may be building into the greenbelt. They may have to extend the size of Guildford to accommodate what would be 2,000-3,000 houses at the time. And so they're very nervous about going out public with that approach being seen to be one that could be supported by the council. Eventually, as I say, 2013, the study was published, and as it turns out, the councillors were entirely right to be nervous about the public response. There was a lot of interest, a lot of concern. It's not unusual to have individual councillors using the anti-development ticket to try and get elected, but in this instance, there was even a political party was formed. This was in the run-up to the general election 18 months or so ago. Political party formed simply to oppose development in the greenbelt. So it really brought home what a massively contentious issue it is. But this doesn't get around the problem of where housing is going to go, as I'm sure maybe we go on to. There is a massive demand for housing. It's not as simple as has been hinted at in some of the recent government documents as saying, well, let's concentrate on the brownfield land. Obviously that will be done. That has been done for many years now, not just recently, but many years. That's been the focus, and it's not going to be enough. There's, I think, 25,000 homes on average have been built in London in the last 10 years. The demand is for 50,000 a year. We're way behind, so effectively there just isn't the capacity to accommodate all the housing need. Paul was entirely right. There's a lot of sensitivities, a lot of positive, valuable parts about the greenbelt that absolutely need to be taken into account when determining where to develop and where to expand our major towns and cities. But we can't simply say it's too tricky. As a result, let's just keep it in the towns. Greenbelt studies can and have been undertaken to identify those areas that are less sensitive, that will have less impact and can accommodate development in a sustainable fashion. I think one of the interesting things to come out of the Guildford work was that we were asked to produce subsequent volumes of work in connection with that study, one of which was looking at the options of new settlements, again within the greenbelt, but to accommodate a substantial level of housing, up to 2,000-3,000 houses. It's quite possible that, and sorry, just to clarify, the Guildford study still hasn't been formally adopted by the council. They're still going through the final processes through their emerging local plan as to exactly what they're going to do with that issue. So nothing determined, but it's quite possible that they could choose to incorporate a new settlement, maybe alongside some smaller urban expansions. One of the reasons being that the new settlement is largely in the middle of nowhere, and as a result has less people jumping up and down and objecting about it, as opposed to adding on a couple of thousand houses to an existing main settlement where a lot of people will be directly affected, can see it more immediately. Whereas in fact the new settlement may not be as sustainable with regards to its connectivity, the transport generation, as would happen if you were to attach those 2,000 houses, for example, onto the main urban area. So it's got increasingly political, not surprisingly, but it's almost moved away. The greenbelt has almost moved away as a planning tool to assist sensible growth of development towards a real political football. And I think that's been seen in the London mayoral elections as well. All the candidates putting forward are very much keep the greenbelt largely as it is, because they're aware of a lot of people just get very concerned when you suggest about dipping any development into it at all. So it's contentious. Unfortunately, that doesn't answer the big question as to where the many thousands of houses are going to go, and it needs some political figures to accept that they're going to upset some people, but it's not just their existing residents that they need to address, it's the future growth of the towns, the districts, the regions as a whole that has to be addressed.
Well, it's a really interesting angle that you brought on that, because when we were researching the exhibition, that issue of politics, this is a political issue, really kind of rises up. And actually the thing you sat on recently, Paul, the RTPI event that we had at the Building Centre, I think the chap who was from the National House Builders Federation, he raised that point that I don't have anything to say it's the politicians that have to decide. But the problem is politicians get elected, as you just pointed out, and how are we going to get out of this sort of impasse? Because the politicians, they can't go after votes of people who don't live there yet. So there's an issue that isn't represented, as it were, in the political system, isn't it? Which is these people who don't have homes, or the general pressure on housing, but those people do not have a vote really in the discussion.
Well, that's right, and obviously going back a few years, there was strategic planning, and basically the local politicians then had the situation that they could say, well, the bad news has been imposed on us from a higher level. We don't like it, but we've got to deal with it, and we've got to find the housing accordingly. Obviously, with the localism agenda that the current and previous governments have brought in, the thinking is very strongly that really it's down to the local politicians, local individuals, as to what happens in your patch, and that's, as you say, that then gets very hard to square the circle as far as how it is going to come forward. I would hope that before too long, those that are elected perhaps on the Save the Greenbelt ticket will look at these issues in more detail, recognise that we can't carry on giving this as a solution. It's not a solution, and there will be justification for why some changes have to be made. Time will tell. I mean, I was rather hoping that even though the Tories, prior to getting in at the last election, they went very strong on the Greenbelt is sacrosanct case, and it was clearly effective, and I thought they may have loosened a bit, but in fact they've largely stuck to their guns on that. You could say, well, great, they're actually doing what they said in their manifesto, so well done them. But yeah, I do really worry that it's burying heads in sand somewhat until it becomes such an issue that it's going to really cause massive problems in our existing urban areas.
Well, let's switch across to Paul Lincoln from Landscape Institute, because you've conducted this research among your members, so you've really reached out to a broad group of pretty informed people, trying to get a sense of forward thinking on how we can move forward with the Greenbelt, and these people obviously are, well, you can tell us that they represent a range of positions on the Greenbelt, but hopefully they've got a lot of constructive intelligence.
Well, lots of constructive intelligence, yes. So I work for the Landscape Institute, which represents the UK's landscape architects, and we wanted to engage people in many ways a new debate about the state of the Greenbelt, the future of the Greenbelt. And what we felt was that although the issue had been incredibly well aired by the likes of the Adam Smith Institute and others that have already been mentioned, a group of people who are absolutely in the middle of this debate, landscape architects, landscape managers and landscape planners who are dealing with Greenbelt issues on a day-to-day basis, were not at the moment part of that debate. So what we wanted to do was to start a discussion initially with our members and then with a wider group of people, which we intend to conduct over the next year to 2 years, to look at whether or not we can perhaps not just broaden but also deepen the debate about Greenbelt, and whether there are issues beyond Greenbelt good, Greenbelt bad, whether there are more complicated ways of examining this. And I think it's fair to say that on the whole, most landscape architects, many of whom will have come from a very environmental background, are warmly in support in many cases of some Greenbelt policies. I haven't got the exact figures yet, but there are major divisions as well. But what's also very interesting is that part of the debate that our members are interested in looking at is also not just about the planning designation and not just about issues around how we stop sprawl, but also around issues around landscape character, around landscape quality. And I think for me, one of the most interesting topics is the way in which we apply some of the learning from green infrastructure development in the city to a rural setting. And a lot of the debates that we've been having, that Natural England, that many agencies have been having over the past 5 to 10 years around the significance of green infrastructure and the significance of natural capital is now, I think, starting to be aired about our understanding of Greenbelt, not only in terms of its benefits, in terms of the environment, but also within the public health agenda. And certainly the issue of who gets to have access to the greenbelt, how you have access, the nature of that access is a very interesting one. For example, there are maybe a dozen to 18 greenbelt golf courses on greenbelt land. These are privately run. Is access to a golf course by golf club members the same as general public access? And yet there are many ways of offering access in a much wider way than one might offer with a golf course. So there's some interesting issues about access, there's some very interesting issues about quality, but there's also, I think, issues about whether or not we should extend the greenbelt, because there is a lot of logic in increasing the extent of the greenbelt. There's also a lot of logic in perhaps changing the way in which it is figured or constrained. And what's already been touched on with the Cane Hill example is looking at the relationship between greenbelt and access to public transport, so how you develop a greenbelt policy that works with a larger scale transport policy. So there's a whole heap of issues which we want to talk about. In many ways, today is just an invitation to you to engage in a longer debate, to come to the exhibition at the Building Centre, which starts next week. We're also planning to take the exhibition across the UK, so there'll be many other opportunities. And we also plan, initially at the Building Centre, to run a series of debates looking at the experience of practitioners, looking at the future of the greenbelt, but also looking at the issue of how one might green the greenbelt and what it would mean to have a greener greenbelt, a more accessible greenbelt, or maybe to look at green donuts, green arches, different configurations. Because my worry is that we've collectively painted ourselves into a corner, and that this is such an important topic in terms of public health, in terms of housing, I suppose what we want to do is to engender a different type of debate, and I'm really delighted that today is the very beginning of maybe a year's worth of discussion.
So Paul, I'll pick up on something there about rethinking the greenbelt and see if you have any willingness to play with this thought. Should we maybe expand in certain areas and redesignate other areas for development in order to make the greenbelt better serve its sort of objectives, moving the land around a bit?
Greenbelt's there primarily for its planning purposes, and we want it to continue to be so. So it should always be there primarily as a tool to stop urban sprawl and prevent bases from joining up with each other. There are some large, as well as the large towns and cities the greenbelt surrounds, it also has a function in protecting the setting of some historic towns as well, so places like Bath, Oxford, Cambridge and York. And we think there are a few large and or historic urban areas that don't have greenbelts where there is a case for designating new ones, and the areas that particularly come to mind are places like Leicester, for example, which is the largest city in England which doesn't have a green belt. Also historic cities like Norwich and Exeter, and also Southampton as well no longer has a green belt, although parts of the green belt that were formerly designated have now become the New Forest National Park, but we still think there's the case for a new green belt around other areas of Southampton to stop Southampton from joining up and with places like Winchester and Portsmouth. So we think there's work still to be done, but also as well in terms of the green belts we currently have, we do think that more needs to be done to get to having a better green belt in future, because there is scope to manage the land in many of our green belts better. Overall, the quality of the landscape in the green belt is surprisingly good. If you look at the work that Natural England did as part of their Countryside Quality Counts project, they actually found that there was far more of the green belt that was in a good condition in landscape terms than was neglected. But we do think we can do more, and the work of the Natural Capital Committee in particular shows that there's scope to get much more woodland and wetland around our major towns and cities. So we think more should be done. And
can you use development to help that? Clearly resources are always in short supply. Could you encourage maybe a certain idea of taking some brownfield, and yes, we'll build on that more, but we want a sort of a planning gain from that in order to create this improved forest over here?
There's a range of mechanisms that could be used. In some cases, planning gain has worked well, and the government used growth area funding, for example, to promote the Green Arc, which was a project that aimed to improve the green belt around the northeast of London, going into Essex over a few years. That was a project that managed to do some good things. But we think that the regional park model is something worth looking at. But also, we get the impression at the moment that the local authorities aren't taking the opportunities that the National Planning Policy Framework offers them to plan positively for the future of the green belt. The local authorities review their green belts as you've pointed out, but in most cases they're just focused on which sites they can take out of the green belt for development. They're not actually looking at opportunities to get more positive use of the green belt in future, and we think that's a major missed opportunity that needs to be.
So you think this would maybe mix in a sort of more positive vision for their getting better value out of the green belt, and at the same time as they're looking to maybe put some development in there in order to meet their housing targets?
Yeah, I mean, one of the advantages of notable expansion into the greenbelt of scales of 2,000-3,000 houses is that you really would expect there to be fundamental to that good access to open space, recreational facilities that quite often won't be available on that edge, the built-up edge that you get at present. I'd be very surprised if any councils are considering those sort of scales of expansion without incorporating that, not only for the new population to move in, but also the established population that actually may just have a farmer's field to look on. And so in visual terms, yes, very open, may be attractive, but as far as its usability, as touched upon, it may not offer anything at present, and it's a real opportunity to improve those elements.
So how would you go from that situation to taking that farmer's field and making it into a new, recreational open space of quality?
Well, it would be
force the developer to invest in the right way, and take somebody's land in that process.
It would be a requirement that says to a developer, if you do want to come forward with a significant number of houses, then not only do you have to provide good amenity, open space, leisure facilities for those new houses, but also let's offer improvements to the existing population in our main settlement as well. So by adding a public park, often linear parks that are connecting, can sometimes offer the opportunity to connect up existing recreational areas that are on the outskirts, but doing that. And so it would be a fundamental requirement of any master planning exercise that they have to bring that forward before they start getting any positive support from the planners.
The CPRE, Paul, on your website somewhere, I saw the quote saying basically it's just not in the house builder's interest to actually ever meet the housing supply that need. We can't look to the private market to meet this need. And so I'm wondering what you, as an organisation, would, if you see yourself any responsibility to bring forward a thought on how to meet the housing supply need, or are you? You're sort of sitting back and saying, well, look, they'll never meet the problem, but actually that's not our problem. I mean, I just raise that quote. It's on the website.
No, we've always been very clear that you do need to build much more new housing in this country, and not all of the new housing that we need to build can be on brownfield sites, but there is a huge brownfield potential which not everyone fully appreciates. And if you look at returns that were done by local authorities to the National Land Use Database, for example, they found that there was enough brownfield land available and suitable for development across England for at least 1 million new homes. And when you talk in the context of London, that over recent years, that local authorities in London have been giving enough planning permissions to build 55,000 new houses per year. But the clear majority of these planning permissions are not being taken up because, as you pointed out, it's not in the interests of the private house building industry to increase the supply of housing to any significant degree. The supply of housing will remain largely fixed as it currently is, while we rely on private house builders to build most new housing. So if we are going to increase the supply of housing, we do need to be looking at encouraging local authorities to build more, also to be encouraging perhaps self and custom build in particular, and we've seen very good results in places like Germany and Holland in terms of getting well-designed new developments through the self and custom build model. But we also need to make sure as well that we're not exaggerating the amount of the problem, because at present a lot of local authorities are being encouraged by the government's planning policies to come up with massively exaggerated assessments of housing need, which are well beyond what's deliverable or what's needed. And the effect that this is having is that it's allowing private developers to cherry pick sites in the green belt or on greenfield sites, and to allow them to ignore the brownfield sites as being unviable or too difficult. So we need to get a sensible balance, and that comes through a brownfield first approach, but also encouraging a wide variety of people to build the new houses, but also as well making sure that we're not building new housing in a rushed fashion and junketing well-established planning policies like Greenbelt unnecessarily in a rush to build numbers at any cost.
Andy, can brownfield first work?
Well, if I could just come back on a point with regards to the 55,000 houses approved, but only half of that built in London. The HBF, I'm sure, will be able to give a much more detailed response, but my understanding is that includes outline consents as well. So in reality, that isn't a planning permission that you can actually get on and build, because you have to subsequently go in and get reserved matters consent. I think the suggestion that house builders won't build houses is very much exaggerated. There may be some instances where some developers have chosen not to progress quite as quickly as they can. May be down to a skill shortage as much as anything in some areas where it's got particularly hot as far as the development areas. But I can assure you the vast majority will want to get on. It's basic economics. If they can get on and build their houses, they'll be getting other permissions as well to get the pipeline coming forward. So I think there was a statistic I read recently in a report, I think just came out a few weeks ago on behalf of Shelter, that looked at some of the different options for dealing with the surplus in London in particular. And I think they refer to there being about 220 town centres within London at present. And if we're to address the additional housing requirement just within town centre redevelopment within London, it requires each town centre to build a 50-storey tower every other year for the next 10 years, just to catch up and keep pace of what we need to do. And I think it goes back to the point, and no one is suggesting that should happen. Well, I don't know. I assume the CPRE aren't suggesting that should be the way it's done. But I think it just goes back to the point that we've got to look at lots of different solutions here. Brownfield's massively important. We can increase the density of some of our town centres, but there will have to be some greenbelt development as well if we're going to properly address this massive housing shortage.
Can I come back on that? It's important to remember that London, comparatively, is a very low-density city when you compare London to some other of the great world cities that it claims to be competing with, places like Shanghai, Hong Kong, Mumbai, and other places. No one's suggesting that you build London to the density of those places, but when you look at London in the world context, it's still very low density, and I think the Shelter and Quad report that you mentioned, Andy, did recognise that there is a lot of scope to increase densities in London, not just in town centres, but also more generally. And I think one of the things that is beginning to be appreciated by the mayoral candidates is that if you invest in improving transport infrastructure, things like the tube, the overground to the outer suburbs, you will gradually get an increase in densities within those areas, not just within the town centres. So there is scope to do more. The green belt itself it covers about 13% of England, and there's also scope as well to develop beyond it, and the government is encouraging that in places like Ebbsfleet, Milton Keynes, Peterborough, other places. So you can build more in those places, and there's also a lot of scope as well to harness the need for development in our core cities in places like Birmingham, Manchester and Bristol as well, places which are crying out for development, and those places too have a lot of brownfield land within them or in the small towns that surround them. And again, if you invest in the transport in those areas, you can actually get a gradual increase in densities and actually build in areas where people want to see development.
Well, sure, Andy wants to come back on a few points, but we're kind of running out of time, and I should allow Paul back in with a point or two. So I thought maybe we just should step back a little bit and get, is there one or two really exciting ideas that you saw in all those feedback from your members that you'd like to throw out, as it were, at the end here?
Yeah, I think there's 2 points I'd make. One is that a lot of our members are talking about quality and they're talking about health. And what this makes me think is that although on one level the debate about Greenbelt is around planning, it's also around how we live, where we live, and the way in which we relate to each other. Maybe 50-storey buildings in the centre of town is actually a much better idea than touching the Greenbelt or not. There's a huge debate about what happens in suburbs, and there's already been said London in particular is not a dense city, but it's quite a strangely arranged city in terms of this part of London probably has some of the densest housing. If you leave this building, astonishing 54-storey tower blocks and not a tree in sight. And yet if you go on the cable car here, you'll also see astonishing areas of dereliction that have not been touched since the war. So we've got these really interesting contradictions, and yet we also have to have a debate around planning designation around Greenbelt. So I think there's a much deeper and in many ways a much more complicated debate about how we choose to live and how we choose to live with our neighbours. And I think that's certainly the debate we should be having over the next few weeks.
Well, thank you very much. And it is, if you go to the buildingcentre.co.uk site, and you'll find some talks going up there fairly soon if you want to go to any events. And by all means, please come along to the exhibition. It's free to attend. It opens next Wednesday. And I hope to see you there, and thank you for listening. Thank you to all my panel as well.